final Stop Brasil, Chapter 14. Apprenticeship. My next conquest was Jogo, a 30-year-old married Greek with a fast Ford Capri. He was not necessarily one of the best-looking Greeks, but had an excitingly striking face, and our sex in his car was for me an exciting variety. In spite of discretion in the restaurant, where he paid everything for me but never sat down at my table, it was an open secret that we had an affair. Simi warned me, "Be careful, Rita. You don't know Greek women. If Jogo's wife catches you, she'll kill you." We already were together for months, as my last school holidays finished. The apprenticeship training started, but my thoughts were mostly somewhere else. I didn't like this kind of work at all and simply had no ambition for the office. The only positive thing was the relatively high level of training allowance. Every afternoon after work, the yellow Ford Capri waited for me on the parking lot, and every day we took a detour into a forest where we made love in the car. Afterwards, Jogo would drop me off at home. Now and then I still saw my old friends from school, but in the meantime I found a lot of new friends, like Brigitte. Everybody called her Gitti, a working colleague. We sat in the same department and chatted most of the time. Gitti was 35 and a single mother with a little son. She was fascinated when I told her all about my experiences. Soon she invited me to her home in a flat right next to her parents. This would have been unthinkable for me, but this family was very cordial, and they all showed their loving for one another. That's why I came to visit Gitti often, and felt very well in the company of her and the family. Then I met Petra at the bus stop. She was the complete opposite to Gitti. My first impression was mistaken, however, when I thought, "You arrogant cow with your heavy makeup." She started talking to me, and thus the ice was broken. Also, she showed with her behavior that she came from the upper class. She seemed quite a funny sport. Her apartment was very near, just 1 block away from the house I lived in. She was somehow exotic, but comfortably furnished. Apparently, she didn't have many friends, and soon I was keeping her company every night. We drank bourbon on ice, listening to Leonard Cohen, which wasn't really my thing, and talked about God and the world. Her boyfriend, Uwe, was stationed with the German Bundeswehr in Holland, and usually stayed with her only at the weekends. Also with Jogo, it became boring for me at some point. It was always the same routine. I wanted more, so I told him one day that it was over and he shouldn't pick me up anymore. Of course, he wanted to know why, and especially if there was someone else. No, there's no one else, but I want a boyfriend with whom I can show myself openly and go out. Go to the movies, in restaurants, and dancing. With you, I can't do all these things, I told him. First, I didn't see him again for a while. I spoke to Petra about my feelings and my fears. With my 15 years, I already had some experience, but not once had I the feeling that I was really in love with someone. Not even great excitement. Almost all of my friends in my or Petra's age had fixed partners and talked of love and marriage. But I didn't even know what the word love meant. "You haven't found the right person yet." Petra was trying to destroy my doubts. But who was the right person? And how would I know if it was love? 2 weeks later, I didn't even think of Jogo anymore. It was him who waited me with his Capri back in the parking lot. I was almost angry when he asked me to climb into the car. He announced that he would invite me on the following Saturday. Saturday? We had never met on Saturdays. The weekends were reserved for his family. But this time he insisted on the Saturday to invite me for dinner. Secretly, I had to smile, and after I took my time, I accepted. It was somewhat unusual and far from a romantic dinner for two, because I was the only one eating. Jorgo drank Coca-Cola. But the food was very good, and I enjoyed it from appetizers to dessert. After dinner, I treated myself with a cup of coffee first, and then with a whiskey coke, on which I almost choked when Jorgo said, "I'm getting divorced." "But not because of me, right?" I asked cautiously. "I love you," was his answer, and I now felt completely overwhelmed with the situation. I didn't know what to say. Jorgo proposed to move on, but we didn't go home. I knew neither the city of Menden nor the disco Jorgo brought me, but I was fascinated. The guests here were British, whites and blacks, and only black music was played. It was a whole new world for me, and I was amazed like a small child in front of the Christmas tree. Jorgo and I sat at a table. It was clear to me that he would not dance. He only came here because of me, but he didn't have a problem with me alone on the dance floor, where I obviously was not alone for long. Several of the nice-dressed and good-looking guys were dancing with me. I would have liked to talk to them in English, but didn't want to hurt Jorgo's feelings. So I sat down again obediently at his side. To show him how much I appreciated his effort, I slept with him again, but then told him that I didn't love him, but liked him. In no case did I want to destroy his marriage. I also made it clear that I was not thinking the least about marriage or something similar. But as it was, I also didn't want to go on. In response, he only asked me the question whether I would go out again with him the coming Saturday. Coming back to this disco was too tempting, as I would have been able to say no. This time I remembered exactly the way of the approximately 100 kilometers distant city. Jorgo invited me to a pizzeria, where I ate a pizza as good as never before or ever after, simply unique. At the disco I was happily dancing again with the British guys, and returned from time to time dutifully back to the table, where Jorgo sat and watched me. Then a tall, black-haired Englishman walked into the disco, and our eyes met. I admired his muscular body. It didn't escape Jeff that I was not alone, yet he came to our table asking me to dance. We talked, and he gave me the explanation why in this nightclub and in this city were so many Englishmen. Menden was a garrison town, and home to a large British Army barracks, a relic of the peace agreement after World War II. In the case of an attack, the British were as allies of the Americans in Germany to defend the western part. Jeff asked me who the guy was with whom I was here, and I lied that he was just a good friend. Jorgo must have probably recognized that this was the end for us, because when I told him later that it wouldn't go well with us, since he was twice as old as I was, he demonstrated to see a point in this. He already knew me well enough to know that I was full of curiosity about life and full of temperament, and nobody could stop me. With Jeff, I arranged a meeting for the coming Saturday and could hardly wait for it to come. I excitedly told Kitty of my new conquest. She listened intently and then asked me, "How are you going to get to Menden?" "Well, I will hitchhike," I answered lightly. "Are you crazy?" "That's far too dangerous," she excited herself. But I reassured her, "Don't worry, nothing will happen to me." So I went on that Saturday evening by bus to the center, ran across the railroad bridge to the other side, and stood by the road leading out of our city in the direction to Menden. It became my regular routine, and I seemed to have always a guardian angel on my side, because nothing ever happened to me. Contrary, I met lots of interesting and helpful people, which many times drove partial detours of up to 50 kilometers just to bring me safely to my destination. I indeed found the disco back again and entered hesitantly. For the first time I walked into a disco alone. But alone I wouldn't stay long, because a clique of girls I had not noticed before, but now they were eyeing me curiously and started to talk to me. We all liked each other straight away, but these girls didn't like at all that I hitchhiked. Ulrike, one of them, offered me spontaneously to stay in her house. Her parents had no problem with it, and that way I wouldn't have to hitchhike back during the night, but could do it if I really wanted during the day. We talked, drank, and danced all night, and it did not even bother me that the actual reason for my coming back to this place didn't even show up. Connie and I spent the night with Ulrike in her parents' house on the outskirts of Menden. They were very friendly and obviously used to have guests. Even Bob, Ulrike's boyfriend, usually stayed here, which surprised me. A foreigner in our house? Unthinkable. But here it was normal. Most of the girls here had English boyfriends. Only Connie was a bit of an exception. I was quickly aware of it that she often changed her men, and a fixed residence she also didn't seem to have. Still, I liked her and her sense of humor. Every Saturday I came to Menden and finally met Jeff again, who took me with him to the barracks, where we slept together. Soon I stayed some nights in the barracks and the other nights at Ulrike's house. In between, I also went with the others and got to know other clubs. Connie warned me Jeff was after all the girls here, and I shouldn't take him too seriously. And she was right. Jeff and I had been together a few weeks as two girls entered the disco. No one knew them. They were English girls and both very pretty. Regardless of my presence, Jeff immediately began to flirt with the blonde one. I was mad because it hurt my pride. Connie and the other girls were watching the scene for a while, and then Connie went over to the table of the two girls to make clear that the guy she was flirting with was my boyfriend. Jeff then began to argue with Connie. This was simply getting too stupid and embarrassing for me, and therefore I walked over to Connie and told her in English so everybody could understand, "That guy is not my property," and addressed to the blonde, "You can have him if you like." I turned around and went back to the table where Ulrike sat with Bob. To my astonishment, the blonde girl followed me and spoke. "I'm very sorry, I didn't know." With a consolatory smile, she introduced herself as Mary and wanted to know my name, and then she invited me for a drink. Pointing towards Jeff, she only said, "These types are not worth to argue over them." And while Jeff was a total loser on the entire field, Mary and I became good friends. It was an exciting story for me to have an English friend. When I visited her, I was amazed what a nice big house she lived in with her parents. Her father was an officer of the British Army. With her and her family, I learned many new things. My English improved, and for the first time in my life, I ate Indian curry. For English people, a very popular meal, but I had some struggle to get used to it. I coughed and spluttered. I never had been eating anything spicy like this before. Water ran from my nose and eyes at the same time. Mary and her parents had a good laugh about this. Meanwhile, it was relatively peaceful at my home. My parents were satisfied with my lie that I spent the weekends with a new friend. For them, It was only important the neighbors wouldn't talk about us, especially about me. And this they couldn't do because my scope was then moved to another town where nobody knew me. However, my apprenticeship training was one great disaster. The 3 month theory teaching blocks in the school were simply pissing me off, and my colleagues were all snooty. The guys, most of them trainees as bank clerks, were dressed in shirt and tie. This was absolutely not my world. I didn't even bother with the daily record sheets. I would not be allowed to participate in the final exams if they weren't complete. The only things mattered to me were the weekends. I spent with my new friends in Menden. Since I didn't have a boyfriend, I stopped taking the pill. On my 16th birthday, my father offered me a glass of beer and a cigarette, with the comment, "You are 16 now. You are allowed to do that." In order not to upset him, I drank the beer, although I didn't like it. The smoking I started with his cigarette and never stopped it. Shortly later, Petra told me that he was going to get married and move to Holland with Uwe. This was sad news for me, because during the week Petra's flat was still my daily meeting point. However, she came up with a good idea. "Why don't you take over my apartment?" I liked the proposal too much, but how should I convince my parents? This was easier, though, than I thought, and everything happened very quickly. My parents signed the lease for me and even went to buy furniture. They were probably relieved to get rid of me. And I was proud as Oscar to have my first own apartment in the age of 16. As before, I went to drink coffee and to have dinner with my parents, but by the special distance of the relationship, now was a bit more relaxed. My old friends came to visit me again. Sabine came usually on Saturday mornings and brought fresh bread rolls for our breakfast together. Gitti came by in the afternoons more often, and my former schoolmate Dietmar introduced me to his new girlfriend Margaret, who together with her parents had recently moved in our neighborhood, where they jointly opened a snack bar. I liked her from the first moment, and between us began a friendship which lasted for many years. One Saturday night I met Ian and flirted heavily with him. Actually, I did it to make Jeff jealous. We both suffered in our own ways. I suffered for my wounded pride, and he also suffered because he wasn't used to be kicked off in such a cool way. But how I got stuck precisely with Ian, I could not explain myself. I had absolutely no deeper feelings for him. I just liked him, and that was all. Ian didn't even correspond by appearance to the type of man I dreamed of, with his blue eyes and blonde hair. But he often came and stayed over the weekends with me, and so it happened that I rarely ever went to Menden anymore. Either he found friends who brought him to my place, or he borrowed a car. When I presented him to my parents, they were all but delighted at first about this foreigner. But now it was my sisters who turned the table because they liked him very much, and also did my two brothers-in-law. Therefore, he was soon a welcome guest at the obligatory Saturday or Sunday meetings at my parents' house, and practically belonged to the family. During the week, I was feeling very lonely in my apartment, so I decided to turn one of my big dreams of childhood into reality. I bought a dog, Helen, a purebred Cocker Spaniel puppy, 8 weeks old. My parents almost went crazy, because I had once again not spoke to them about it, and it was clear that I could not leave the little puppy alone when I worked or went to school. Helen was very stubborn and very difficult to educate. It took 9 months until she was clean and did her business no more inside the house. Nevertheless, I loved my little Helen. This hated apprenticeship gave me many more worries. I was then 17, and had managed to pass through the interim exams just about, only with lots of difficulties. In addition, I didn't have the least vantage to continue with it. I simply couldn't identify myself with nuts and bolts, nor get interested in bookkeeping and commercial arithmetic. I felt trapped. I now only saw one way out: to get pregnant. Then I could throw the apprenticeship. And indeed, it didn't take long until I actually was pregnant. But here my real problem started. Ian and I were in constant conflict, but he faced the pregnancy quite positively. My parents, however, made a real drama out of it, especially because I refused to marry. The entire family was getting on top of me. I had to listen to, "How do you think about your future? Alone with a child? What are the people going to say? And what do you want to live off? No, you need to marry so the child has a father." But marriage was something that I absolutely didn't include in my plans, especially not with Ian. If I eventually would marry, then only with a man I really loved. And for the beginning, I could leave from social services until I had my graduation in the pocket and was able to study. Those were my plans. But with those, I stood pretty much alone. No one was on my side. I felt increasingly forced into a corner and forced into the same pattern as my sisters. Every Saturday afternoon, I sat with Ian in the family surrounding at my parents' house. Coffee time in the afternoon up until the barbecue in the evening. But no one saw or wanted to see if my face was swollen from crying. I began to stuff myself with food out of frustration. My preference was sour herring with cocoa. Anyone who watched me eating this perverse combination had to choke. I received an offer for help, though, and this from a very much unexpected side. The trainee, who had begun a year after me with his apprenticeship in the company, took me aside one day. "Rita, finish the apprenticeship. We can sit down together every day studying for the exam. You can make up for what you've missed. Man, you're not stupid. You can manage the exam if you just want it, and I'll help you with it. I am also not stupid, and blind even less. I see how unhappy you are with your situation. Once you have the exam in your pocket, you are independent and don't need to marry." I was amazed that someone with whom I had very little to do discovered that my show of the happy, expectant mother and future wife was only on the surface. Some days I seriously thought about the offer, but the thought about catching up almost 2 years' training, in which I didn't study at all, in only a few months until the final exam, scared me off. So I used my legal right and let the medical give me a sick note up until the end of the pregnancy. As a pregnant woman, I couldn't be fired. After the birth, I wouldn't return to the company anyway. My salary I continued to receive until the end of my pregnancy. I used my free time for long walks in the forest with Helen. She and I were one team, but for Helen, Ian was an intruder whom she disliked. The feeling was mutual, because Ian began to show his real character and his hot temper. Many times I caught him beating Helen or kicking her with his heavy army boots. I threw him out, but he came back, asked for forgiveness, and promised not to do it again. Through the pressure of my parents, we reconciled again. My belly was growing big now, but of marriage I still didn't want to know anything. Finally, a huge clash happened, and my father raged terribly. Carmen, my eldest sister, had told him that the social welfare office, should they give me financial support, would retrieve the money from the earnings of my father. That was too much for him. He punched his fist on the table and gave me an ultimatum. And Ian, with whom I had quarreled again, put me under pressure too. We either got married or he would be gone. In other words, he would apply to return back to England, and I would not be able to draw child support from him. So I resigned and agreed to a marriage. Since it was already difficult at those times in Germany to marry a foreigner, and I was in the 8th month, my father and Ian made the decision together that the wedding would take place in England. The longest drive with a car for my father was by then the trip to the Baltic Sea and back. Otherwise, he used the car only to go to work or for short trips on Sundays. But he intended to take us all to England in his car. I could barely imagine my father driving on the left side of the road. Nevertheless, the journey began. We drove through Belgium to Ostend and then took the ferry to England. An inconvenient trip because we didn't book any sleeping cabins. And when I strolled across the ship in search for a quiet corner and finally found one to get a little sleep, I created a panic-stricken search by my mother, who thought I had fallen overboard.